This is the fifth part of the Ezekiel and Daniel screencast, and we are about to continue by looking at some of the interpretive keys for apocalyptic literature. As an aid to correctly interpreting prophetic literature, we're going to look at a number of principles that need to be considered when reading this genre. First, we should always be aware of the historical context of the text we're reading. None of the apocalyptic texts in the Bible are set in a historical vacuum. Rather, they were written to real people going through real situations. Consequently, the message of the texts we read should have a degree of significance to the original readers. The text of Daniel, for example, would have had a primary relevance for the listeners at the time of Daniel, and it is unlikely that it solely relates to the incidents and people in the 20th century. Understanding the immediate context, historical context, should therefore be a primary goal for understanding the text itself. Second, we should primarily be looking for a symbolic meaning of the text as opposed to a literal one. Thus, much of the imagery should not be viewed as real, but symbols and representations of other entities. For example, the vision of the ram and goat in Daniel 8 are not to be taken literally, but are symbolic of nations. Similarly, the horns are representative of leaders from within those nations. Third, it's important to work from the known to the unknown. Many meaningless debates arise within the church from matters of which we are unsure. Apocalyptic literature unfortunately bears a healthy crop of issues which are not immediately understandable. It's important therefore to establish within apocalyptic literature those things of which there can be no doubt, and from there move to the more dubious issues. I, for instance, can only be sure that the ram and goat, as I previously mentioned in chapter 8, represent nations and their horns represent leaders. I can be certain of this simply because the same chapter provides an interpretation of these figures. See verses 20 to 21. Were this not the case, then I could only offer a tentative supposition of what they represent. Perhaps the most important thing we need to establish when reading apocalyptic literature, similar to the point above, but it's those things that we do not understand. We need to clearly define them. We need to clearly say we do not understand fully what this image is. Unfortunately, this requires a degree of humility for both Bible teachers like myself and preachers, because we pride ourselves on things we do know. Nevertheless, it's important to have the courage when approaching a book like Daniel to begin by making a list of the images found that you do not have a proper explanation for. With these things said, we can now turn to the contents of the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel consists of 12 chapters that can approximately be divided into two sections. Chapters 1 to 6 and chapters 7 to 12. The first section, the Daniel narratives, let's call them, are certainly more easy to both read and understand for the first time reader. They are written in prose and essentially contain three accounts involving testings of some description. The first, in chapter 1, details a young Daniel and his three friends choosing only to eat vegetables whilst training in the king's court, refusing the king's special provision of choice foods. The servant in charge of them agrees to try out their idea, or agrees to let them only eat vegetables, and after a certain trial period of just vegetables, they are seen to be as healthy as all the other students, if you like, in this Kira's tutelage. The second testing story in chapter 3 involves Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Their faith is tested when they refuse to bow down and worship an image of the king. As a punishment for the refusal, the king decrees that they should be thrown into a fiery furnace. They are vindicated by God and are delivered from the furnace into which they had been cast. The third testing story involves Daniel alone in chapter 6. A number of his colleagues conspire against him, and through a clever scheme, they corner the king into condemning Daniel to death by throwing him into a lion's den. Daniel's big crime at this point was to pray to someone other than the king. Because of Daniel's faithfulness to his God, however, he is delivered from the death sentence, and the lions are prevented from devouring him. Concerning these testing stories, we need to think how they relate to the exiles themselves. And one of the big messages, particularly that these three stories tell, is that the exiles must remain true to worshipping and serving God, even to the point or even to the threat of death. Daniel and his three friends did it, and God vindicated them, and the exiles should have the same hope. Interspersing the three testing stories in chapters 2 and 4 are narratives involving dream interpretations, where Daniel interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, and this is followed by an interpretation of a mysterious wall inscription for King Belshazzar. The second major section of the book, chapters 7 to 12, I'm not going to go into much detail on at all, but they contain a series of visions that pertain to future kingdoms that will arise and fall. In the middle of this section, and perhaps most importantly, is a moving prayer of repentance that Daniel makes on behalf of the Israelites. He interprets one of Jeremiah's prophecies in chapter 9, verse 2, and understands that the exile is due to end soon. As a result, he intercedes for the nation. The picture of intercession is indeed a powerful one at this point, because Daniel really had no part in the sin that brought about the exile, and yet he confesses, "We have sinned." In order to successfully stand in the gap for the nation, or for any nation, he has adopted the stance of someone who is partially responsible, even though he has no real responsibility in the crimes committed. This is just a general piece of advice, or general teaching, if you like, for those considering themselves intercessors, that to a point they have to adopt, or they have to stand and take some of the blame for the people that they're interceding for. Ultimately, of course, we see in the life of Jesus, who comes down and he, as the New Testament says, becomes sin for us. So he was very much an ultimate expression of that acceptance of accountability on behalf of another. With the basic contents of the book enumerated, we'll turn now to the final slide of this screencast and look at some of the connections between the book of Daniel and other biblical texts. There are two interbiblical associations I want to briefly mention concerning the book of Daniel. One of them is thematic and the other one is literary. The first one, the thematic connection, relates to the figure of Daniel, or joins or associates, if you like, the figure of Daniel to that of Joseph in the book of Genesis. Both individuals were taken captive in a foreign land. Joseph was sold as a slave by his brothers to slave traders who sold him then on to an Egyptian lord, Potiphar. Daniel, on the other hand, was taken captive from Judah by the Babylonians. Both individuals, in spite of their foreign origins, eventually held a high position of authority in the society of their captors. Joseph, as you know, was eventually prompted to being Pharaoh's second in command. Daniel, too, was prompted to being one of the top officials in the Babylonian Empire. Both Daniel and Joseph were interpreters of dreams. Due to their God-given abilities, they were both promoted and exalted to high positions. Joseph successfully interpreted the cupbearer and baker's dreams, and he also interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh, and it's this latter interpretation that directly led to his promotion. Finally, regarding these similarities, both Joseph and Daniel are seen to reject the pleasures of this world. Joseph refuses the advances of his master's wife, and Daniel, for a short time at least, refused fine and luxurious foods offered by the king, choosing to eat vegetables instead. Also, with respect to Daniel, before interpreting the mysterious inscription on the wall, he refuses to accept any gift the king may offer for its interpretation. Regarding the literary connection, as I'd mentioned previously, the man Daniel clearly has some familiarity with the work of Jeremiah. In the book of Jeremiah 25:11 we read, "This whole land will be a desolation and a horror. These nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. And here he's talking, this is a prophecy towards Judah. These words were apparently referenced by Daniel in chapter 9 verse 2 when he says, "In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, observed in the books the number of the years which was revealed as the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet for the completion of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years." So here we see a direct literary connection where, even though Daniel may not have known Jeremiah personally, it would certainly seem as though he was familiar with his works, and so he thus reinterprets it. It would appear, not reinterprets or interprets it correctly in this particular verse. This basically ends our series of slidecasts on Ezekiel and Daniel. You will need to complete the assignments based on these slides and also the associated readings with it. Please don't neglect the reading of the biblical texts as well, because even though these slides and a lot of the lectures are built to help you understand the biblical text, there is no substitute, of course, for actually reading them.